Hey there. I'm John Hayes, and thanks for joining us for this episode of the Founders Trust podcast. Today, we're discussing how founders can start developing their leadership skills from day one of their startup journey. I spoke with leadership coach, world traveler, and overall badass, Cassa Grant. Cassa and I discuss what it means to be an offbeat leader, the factors that most often hold people back from achieving their leadership potential, how to install a culture of leadership in your startup, and a whole lot more. So I'm really excited to share Cassa's expert advice with you. And stick around to the end of our episode for how you can enter our contest for a free invitation to Clubhouse. So let's jump right in. Today's Startup Spotlight is brought to you by Savier. Savier takes a personalized approach to helping entrepreneurs create a clear path to growth. Through knowledge, coaching, and marketing services, Savier helps entrepreneurs and small business owners apply marketing to achieve their business goals. At Savier, our goal is to empower entrepreneurs to achieve marketing success. Check them out at Savier, that's savvyeur.com today. Hey everyone, I'm here with leadership coach Cassa Grant. Cassa, thank you so much for joining us today. Really excited to get your thoughts on what it means to be a leader, leadership within the context of being an early stage founder, some of the pitfalls that come with that, and a whole host of other topics. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, thank you. I'm so glad to be here, and I'm really excited to talk with you today. So thanks for inviting me.
Of course, anytime. So Cassa, let's jump right into it. Tell us about your journey into the world of entrepreneurship within the context of how you became a leadership coach, why this is something you're passionate about, and ultimately what that path looked like for you to, bring you to this position where you're working with founders and executives on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. So mine is, again, we'll get into this offbeat leader thing later, but my path to this was very bizarre, and I definitely wouldn't be able to tell you, in 20 years I'll be doing this. But I was a teacher. I was a preschool teacher for 5 years. I was a high school teacher for a couple of years. And then I was a university lecturer when I was in grad school. So I got very interested in leadership in that context at a very young, like at 19, basically. And then I ended up I was an adventure travel bus driver. We drove trips all over the US and Mexico and Canada.
Oh, that's
awesome. So
awesome.
Leadership from that perspective was always interesting. And then I ended up working in Antarctica for about 5 years on and off. I spent about 3.5 years down there total. And that's when I started doing more what you would consider to be traditional management, but clearly it was in a very non-traditional environment. And starting to put some of those practices into use that I had learned as a teacher, as a tour guide, et cetera. And then with coaching, when I left Antarctica, I moved to New Zealand because my partner's a Kiwi. He wears very short shorts, and I love them. So he lured me here. And I was trying to figure out what to do. I mean, we kind of go through these phases of reinvention, and it was I felt like I'd been kind of birthed from, we call it the ice, basically. And I started copywriting, and then my first client was actually a change management consultant who was we created some really dense material around leadership. And that was such a great intro to me into the copywriting world, but it was this amazing opportunity to get paid to learn, like in a more structured way around, Reed Drucker and some of these people who are just titans in leadership and get paid to do it, frankly. So that was where I was really like, I am really into leadership. I've always just kind of done it, but I'm super interested in intrinsically motivating people, keeping them happy, not because you're a people pleaser, but because it's the right thing to do. And because from a golden rule or karmic or however you want to talk about it standpoint, like how would you want to be treated as an employee? So those things have always been really important to me. And it just started helping me crystallize that more. So as I moved into more branding, I see branding, culture, and leadership as very intrinsic to each other. So those have all really played together for me as my career's evolved, basically. That's a really long answer. But I hope
that's a fascinating answer. Honestly, Cassa, I think you're the first person I've ever spoken with who spent meaningful time in Antarctica. So I've already learned something new, which is fascinating. Although here in Chicago in the middle of February, it certainly seems like I've experienced Antarctica nonetheless.
Yes, and that was actually part of what pushed me to finally go. Like I had a friend who'd gone for years, and I'm from rural Montana. And I remember one winter I was home, and it was 40 below, and it was just so cold, right? And I was just like, he had pictures on Facebook of him. We have ice stock at New Year's. he's in a t-shirt in Antarctica because it's summer, right? We're on the opposite schedule. And I was just like, okay, I'm pretty sure I can handle Antarctica if I grew up in Montana.
Well, I think you
So,
can
yeah.
handle anything at that point. So,
Yeah, right? Yes, yes.
but you bring up some really interesting points about kind of the intersection between branding and how your experience with kind of copywriting and building brands has worked into your leadership coaching. And one thing that,
Hmm.
I've noticed very quickly about your website, the way you position your coaching materials is that you are focused on working with offbeat leaders. And I found
Hmm.
that phrase really interesting. So I wanted to get your thoughts on what or who is an offbeat leader, and why is this the type of leader or client that you've really dedicated your coaching services to focusing on?
Hmm. I mean, again, a great question. So, and also thank you for the compliment because that took me a long time to arrive at that word. And that's
It
how
immediately
messaging
sticks
is,
with you.
right?
And I wanted to make sure I
Right.
got that question in today because it was something that just kept pinging in the back of my brain. So we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Mm. Yeah, so for me, an offbeat, and actually this came about after being in action, working with people, understanding who was being attracted to me, even if I wasn't saying that message, right? Because um, they were attracted to my story or they were attracted to my background or my kind of philosophy. And because, I mean, I'm that, right? Like, I'm not somebody who I have a master's, but I don't have an MBA. I didn't necessarily groom myself to be a leader from, college or whatever. I mean, I think that anybody who's come to business or a leadership role in a way that feels non-traditional to them, even though it might not really be non-traditional, we kind of have a chip on our shoulders or a little bit of insecurity or imposter syndrome around, I don't have an MBA. Or, maybe I could be doing this better, but I don't really know because my background is in something that feels really random, even though there are generally relevant like things that you're actually using a lot. So the offbeat leader is just somebody who feels a little bit like, I never thought I'd be in this role. I actually really like it. It's been great. And I actually feel like I am pretty good at it in a lot of ways, but I don't feel like I'm not wearing like a gray business suit every day. I have this image of somebody I call Patty Shoulder Pads, who's this like business lady, she's like real serious about business. And I am serious about business, but you can also be fun. And that's the other thing about the offbeat leader is that somebody who is able to not necessarily be overly sharing or overly vulnerable. I mean, that's a whole other conversation, but somebody who is willing to be themselves, but still be powerful as a leader. And that takes a lot of thought and balance and talent to balance, basically. So that's where I can help them integrate maybe these parts of themselves that feel weird or whatever. I'm using a lot of air quotes here, but helping them integrate that into their leadership style and accepting it as part of their leadership style rather than trying to be something that they ultimately feel like they're not. Because I mean, you can't fake that.
Well, and people
So
don't
it's figuring
respond
out how
to
to
it, right?
integrate it.
People don't
No.
respond to leadership that feels imposed or fake. And I think we've all been there at one point or another, whether
Yes.
it was in school or in some sort of work capacity where maybe it's just the tone or maybe it's just the delivery of something where, leadership feels imposed, and that's not real leadership, right? That's almost authority or, and that rubs people the wrong way. And we've all felt that. So
Exactly.
that
Because
authenticity
there's an
seems
exactly
to
that's
really
what it
keep.
is. It's the authenticity, and it's the difference between leadership. I mean, and that's that the difference between leaders and managers is that when you're a leader, you're actually trying to empower your people. You're not trying to scare them. They might have some fear of disappointing you. I mean, it's just like I mean, I say this all the time. It's like parenting and owning a dog. I mean, and this sounds horrible,
Sure.
but it's true. It's boundaries, it's consistency, it's checking in, it's making sure that you're leading from a place of love. To risk sounding cheesy, but to be really coming with the best intentions in mind. And you can lean on systems and frameworks and things like that to help you with the nuts and bolts. But really keeping that at the forefront, I think, is really important.
Well, and people often seem to confuse or blur the lines between leadership and management, right? And maybe it's just
Mm-hmm.
because we've grown up in a very, or from a lot of people have grown up in a very structured way of you have your teacher in school who's your the authority or the principal or whatever, and then you have your professors and you have your first manager when you get your first job, and so it's always been you work within this structured framework, right? So those are
Mm-hmm.
the people who exhibit leadership besides parents or older siblings, mentors in our daily lives. So I think we grow very accustomed to this notion that management equals leadership, but that's really not the case. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure that's that sort of psyche is something that you have to break or deal with a lot with your clients. How do you approach that and really emphasize the difference? Because by no means do I want to put down management, because management provides some sort of structure. But how do you help people think about what those differences are, and then how to be effective in a way that facilitates the benefits or the purposes of both leadership and management?
hmm Yeah, I mean, I think that to be a good leader, you have to fundamentally understand management quite well, right? Like those systems do need to be in place. It's just that a lot of times, if someone's a good manager, there's someone who is more focused on managing work than on, like inspiring people and leading people, right? And you should be doing both, but you should be making sure that you're doing the management part and empowering your people to do that a little bit more, and focusing on coaching them and helping them really create those systems for themselves so that they can lead other people too, right? And I think that, sometimes I see with people that I work with, they're actually afraid to do things like performance reviews, or especially in startup culture. Oh, well, we're new and we're hip and we don't. I mean, not every startup, but it's like, well, that's for corporates and that's dumb. And they're not wrong. Some of these things that corporate companies do are really old and they're not really helpful anymore. I mean, something like performance reviews, though, in my mind, you can call it whatever you want, but they are crucial because it's a feedback session. It's a catalyst for a conversation that needs to happen no matter what. These are check-ins that you're having with your friends and family regularly. You're just not calling them performance reviews or check-ins or whatever.
Right.
But every human needs to understand what's expected of them, how to achieve what they to success, frankly, because it can be really, we've all been there. It's a morale buster. And it's really disheartening to feel like you're just being Sisyphus and rolling some rock up a hill and you don't even know how high the hill is. And it just keeps going on and on forever. So just structures like that create the framework and the safety net to really then lead. And I think that that's what people have. Like people want, well, I'm going to lead and I'm going to inspire. And yes, that's important. But if you don't have those structures in place as well, you don't have the systems, and then leadership isn't from just giving a good speech, right? It's the little things that you do every day. That's what adds up to being a powerful leader. And so that's where helping to figure out like the value of those activities. What are the things that are really going to be the needle movers? What are the things that are really going to help people be able to get your support when they need it? And that's really huge for leadership versus management. I think also with leaders, we're used to being, if you're rising up through the ranks or whatever, you're used to being a technical expert essentially, right? Like you've had a very narrow depth of knowledge and experience. But when you go into leadership, you have to be more broad. You have to have a more breadth. And that is really challenging for people as well. You still have to understand a lot of things. So you're learning more, but you're not the one in there you're the one going, what do you need and how can I help you? How can I get you the resources that you need to get this done? You're not the one strategizing on exactly what we're going to do. And that's a really hard mind shift for a lot of people too.
Absolutely. And let's dig into that a little bit further, because I think it creates this inherent conflict that I see a lot just in speak with people, and I'm sure you do as well, and that whether it's a startup founder or just kind of your day-to-day, employee, people come from an area of expertise, or maybe they come from a technical background and they're really specialized in a particular area. And
Mm-hmm.
naturally, as you move up through an organization, whether it's a small one or a large one, to continue moving up, you often have to take on more managerial responsibility, right? And
Mm-hmm.
you hear all the time people they don't want to do it, or they just want to focus on their software development, or they want to focus on their
Yes.
marketing, or whatever it is. And so it creates this natural conflict where organizations, either have people moving on because they don't want to deal with kind of the people managerial, what appears to be more administrative side.
Mm-hmm.
But then, obviously those people lose on opportunities to keep growing with the firm as well. And they kind of jump ship and go pursue other opportunities where they can just focus on specializing in their area. Right.
Mm-hmm.
How do you get people to kind of start believing in their leadership skills when they don't consider themselves to be a leader, or it's not something
Mm-hmm.
that they really want to focus on, right? Where they just want to focus on doing their day-to-day thing and they don't want to kind of have to deal with this leadership sticky managerial piece, right?
Mm-hmm. That is an awesome question. And I think there's a couple of different answers or um, wings to this basically, or branches basically, because first of all, I mean, I will always advise if you really hate management, you should be doing, like, don't let yourself get pushed into it. Ultimately, I do think that a lot of people, though, it is the way to grow. Like, it is the thing. You start to, this is mastery as a human, right? This is self actualization. You start to master something and then you want to help other people do it. And that is really what leadership's about, right? So, most people who are kind of getting pushed into those things, well, I can't say most, but a lot of them actually do want to help the people below them. They just really don't know how. They can't get out of the doing and into the leading and the overseeing. So one of the ways that we work on that, I actually just helped a CTO who is an amazing person and already the natural leader of the group. And they wanted to put him into a CTO role. And so we did a lot of coaching around his values, because when you can tap into your values, especially people who have a hard work ethic, when you go from something that's very tangible and you can say, yep, I did this, I did that amount of code, I did I did all these things, it just feels really satisfying, right? You're like, it's like building a fence or something. Like nothing was there and now there's something, right?
You see the fruit of your labor, right?
Exactly. Whereas with leadership, it can just feel very nebulous. It's like, wow, I had a lot of conversations today. And so that can just feel like, where's the measuring stick? And that's another side from upper management where they need to have those check-ins so that that's the measuring stick, right? That's to where you see, oh, this is what the team's doing. And this is where we can see the leadership, the effect that the leadership's having, because not having that follow-up is really, again, it's this whole Sisyphean task. You're not seeing the fruits of your labor, and it just beats you down. So I think that's where some startups struggle, because they're not creating that value loop. Like, who's adding the value? Where's the value coming out? And then acknowledging the person who initiated it. So yeah, but I'm also talking about like personal values, strengths, and purpose and vision are the four. Those are the foundation of basically every coaching session and engagement that I do, because I really want people, they can feel a little bit like, oh, whoop-de-doo. Some people have already taken strengths tests, that's fine. But what we need to do is figure out what it means to you. And the values in particular, I find that people's values really affect how they approach things. If they understand their values, they can understand the triggers really well. They can also understand how to motivate themselves better. So, for example, if your top value is, say, loyalty, and you're being, promoted into a leadership role, if you can think about it, but you're kind of like, oh, I just don't really know, blah, blah, blah. But if you think about like, well, my top value is loyalty, is me being in this role is being loyal to these people that I ultimately like and respect, hopefully. That is much more motivating than like, oh, I should just take this because it's a raise and because, they want me to move up or whatever, right? So tapping into those things is really huge, because, we have this negativity bias that helps us tell ourselves these stories like, oh, this sucks, or maybe it does. I'm not saying that you can't have boundaries around that, but there are these things around that we have around like, I'm not ready for this, or I can't do this, or, any of these. I call it the itty bitty, can I curse on this podcast? I call it the itty bitty city committee. Like they're just over there telling you, oh, blah, 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 all these things, right? So I find that if I get that foundation really firmly into place, then from there we can do more strategic and tactical and skill building type coaching. But if I don't do that first, you're still stuck in all these stories, these beliefs that are just not going to get you where you want to go.
That makes a lot of sense, Cass. And honestly, I think there's always kind of this broader discussion about, how much of leadership is innate to someone's personality, and, people either have it or they don't. But now that you mention that, it seems like maybe people's beliefs that they aren't leaders or don't have a natural proclivity to that maybe derive from some of those stories, right? Or kind of those little voices in their ear where it's not themselves telling them that they can't. It's kind of all these other things that they've heard and internalized. And honestly, leadership is work, right? So there's some aspect of needing to put effort into it. And we've all been there where we were trying to get our stuff done. It can seem like a long end to the day to, help someone else get their work done, right, as well. So maybe it's those things. So kind of from that perspective, how much do you buy into this theory that leadership is innate to someone's personality as opposed to, how much of it can be taught or developed, through coaching, reading articles, etc.?
Yeah. I mean, this is a great question too, and this is actually something that goes back to my preschool days. It's called nature versus nurture, right? So, uh, I believe that if you have the interest, I mean, there needs to be a spark of interest. It can't be, I hate this and people are pushing me into it, and I really don't want to do it. That's something else to talk about, and it could be beliefs, like what you were talking about. It could be some other beliefs that need to be dealt with, or it could just be that you just are not. It's not your jam, and that's okay. Like, but I think that most people are definitely able to get better at leading. Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's just like anything. It's like running. It's like, I mean, I use a lot of metaphors and, physical metaphors, but it's building a muscle. It's not rocket science. It is just training yourself to think differently, to see things differently. And these are things that we've done. I mean, you've done this since you were a little kid, right? So it's just figuring out how to create a system to do that. And sometimes, especially with coaching, I mean, it's like having someone to guide you / keep you accountable is really helpful. I mean, I work with a coach and she's fantastic, and I love having that accountability, particularly as an entrepreneur. But it's also about having that mirror of someone who can go, you know what, and call you on your shit. Like, is this really the thing? I mean, because a lot of these fears come up. I mean, we create our world based on our beliefs, and then we have actions that are based on that, and then we create results or poor results based on those actions or lack of actions. So, we need to get to those beliefs first, and then you do the action stuff. So, I definitely think, if someone is innately abrasive or has a very low emotional IQ, or is, I'm clearly, like, there's so many things that, yes, would definitely preclude them being able to be a leader at that time. But I would say for the average person in a startup or whatever, yeah, you can totally learn to get better at it, for sure.
And it sounds like you started to go down this road a little bit, but what are some of those things that most often hold people back from being great leaders, right? Or even just being,
Mm,
kind of good leaders. And sometimes it is probably some of those innate, characteristics like lower, emotional connectivity to people and things. But for those who are trying, right, and they're trying to make an effort to through your coaching services, through different, self-help books, whatever it may be, they're trying to be great leaders. What are some of the things that really hold them back from taking that next step into, really solid level of leadership?
I mean, number one, fear, right? It could be fear of rejection. It could be fear of being taken seriously. It could be fear. I mean, ultimately, it goes to identity building too. Like, if you're creating a new identity for yourself fundamentally, and that can be really scary for people. Fear of letting people down, like, what if I try to do this and I mess up? Well, guess what? You're going to. Like, it happens. It's just a matter of knowing that you can manage and respond rather than react when that does happen. So I would say that, fear is the number one thing. I would also say that one of the things that holds people back is thinking too much, getting into their head too much and not just getting into action. I mean, and this is something I work with the clients and myself all the time, of like, it's so easy to sit around and have analysis paralysis, but then when it comes right down to doing a thing and doing a little tiny thing, people are just like, ooh, I just don't want to do that one little thing, So it's pushing, it's making those mini habits basically every day of like, this is what I do every single day. That's what builds it. So it's getting over those humps and not making it into this huge mountain. Just going, okay, I'm doing one thing today, and then maybe tomorrow I'll do two, but I can just do one, and that's fine.
I think that's really helpful. And I'll be the first to admit, I tend to overthink things, right? And I think it's just because you feel that responsibility, right? And you want to do it
Right.
right. You're passionate about doing it at a high level and, helping your team and executing to the best of your abilities. And so that can naturally lead itself to overthinking it. And then something small snowballs, right? Because you keep pushing it off, or, you keep
Mm-hmm.
reprioritizing or whatever it may be. So
Mm-hmm.
that I can certainly attest to that. Absolutely. I think, two buzzwords that always come to my mind with leadership, and especially when, people are talking about maybe leadership or management gone wrong, are delegation and communication, right?
Yes.
And we've all heard about or experienced the micromanager, or people who give almost too much leeway and kind of let you figure it out for yourself. And that, I'm not really sure which one is worse. And I'm sure people have plenty of rigorous debates about that, but how do you help people work through building their skills in delegation and
Mm,
communication and finding the balance between how hands off to be versus when you need to step in more to really help guide your team more at a more
mm.
detailed level?
Yeah. So, I mean, first for delegation, that's again the mirror, right? I have several sessions where we just go through and figure out like, what do you really need to be doing here, right? Like people love to feel busy because especially not that there shouldn't be that there shouldn't be elements of certain things that are going to make you feel busy, but it's so easy to just kind of get caught up into these busy important things and then not do the actual important things. And a lot of times, particularly at that level, you shouldn't be doing those things, because if you're doing those things, nobody's doing your job, and your job is to be taking care of the people, however that might look. So it's really making people take a good hard look at how they're spending their time and what they actually could be delegating, what they really should be delegating, and then figuring out a plan for how to do that, a plan for how to hold people accountable, a plan for how to communicate the expectations, figure out who to delegate it to, if they're ready for it, what support they're going to need, all of those things, like getting them in the systems of thinking around how to make this more effective and how to make it systematic, because then it becomes habit and it's easy. But if you don't really know how to make it systematic, it can be really overwhelming, and you can either fall into micromanagement or abdication, basically, delegate or abdicate, right? And that's not good either, right? Like really good, true delegation does involve scheduled check-ins. It does involve what are the resources, what are the reasonable timeframes, what else do you need, blah, blah, blah. You need to be checking in. But that's not, oh, you should be doing it this way, or we all know micromanaging is like, it's like, I won't give you any acting on that. But the other thing with communication is, like, again, the mirror. Like, I feel like my tagline should maybe be, why don't you just say that? Because people get so caught up in lingo or corporate speak because they want to sound smart and they want to be taken seriously, and of course. But the problem is that it's so boring. It is so boring. And also, people don't really know what you're saying. So you confuse people, you lose them. So it's like, you need to make sure that you're speaking in the simplest possible terms, which takes way more time and energy, and that you're getting the real point across. So a lot of times, like, we will do role play on feedback sessions. We'll do role play on any important presentations, pitch decks, that kind of thing. And I will just sit there and be ruthless and go, what does this mean? I don't get this. Like, what do you really mean here? And having somebody do that just helps them kind of go, oh yeah, okay. And then we just streamline it. We make sure that it's easy. So, and I give them replicable frameworks to work from, but if they need more of that reflection, it can be really, really helpful to have someone who knows enough, but enough of an outsider to go, are we really, what does that mean? Also the confidence around it, right? Like understanding that, competence breeds confidence. You get competence by practicing, but it takes courage to get to that practice, right? So again, building that foundation of courage and then giving them the tools to start practicing, even if it's just baby steps, so that they build that competence, which then leads to confidence. Confidence in being able to respond to a thing off the cuff if they have to, understanding like, okay, this is probably how this type of scenario would go. So, we'll practice. I mean, we just did a feedback session this week with a client where we ran through awkward feedback, and I had to be like the cranky employee or whatever, and helping her really center into her body, like how is she feeling? Because like that, we get into that fight or flight, helping her work through that, and it really helped her a lot. So yeah, sometimes, like I said, just role play, which feels hilarious, but you don't want to go too over the top. It needs to be, reasonable, but it's also, you want to push their buttons so that they can deal with it, right?
Well, you touched on something really important there, Cassa, and I think it's, how do people handle conflict as leaders, right? And I would imagine that's something that
Mm-hmm.
really pushes people away from wanting to take on leadership roles because they don't want to,
Mm-hmm.
work on, or they don't want to have to handle accountability for their colleagues, right? They don't want to be seen
Mm-hmm.
in maybe a bad light, or as not
Mm-hmm.
being, a people pleaser or something. And those are all very natural emotions, right? We all have, it's part of the fight or flight response. We typically don't want to deal with conflict. I'm sure some people embrace it a little bit more than others, but
Right.
naturally there's that aversion to it in most people.
Right.
you talk about this this foundation of competence that then breeds confidence, which makes it a little bit easier to probably handle those things. But how do you help people kind of establish that foundation in terms of being able to approach conflict head on, understand that it's going to be uncomfortable, and
Hmm.
kind of work through it rather than
Yeah.
just totally avoid it altogether.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, that can look a number of ways in sessions in particular. I mean, we can go through a pros and cons list. What's the worst case scenario? We definitely do that a lot, because it helps people take the monsters away, right? Because a lot of times we are building this up to far bigger than it will actually be. But we also go through making sure that it's the right point that you're trying to make, right? So for a lot of times, like sometimes, people will couch the real issue in some other issue because it feels a little less accusatory or abrasive or whatever. And so making sure that we are really addressing the correct issue is really key. And then giving them, again, the practice to just get on it. Like the longer you let stuff go, as you know, the worse it will get. So helping people really get that bravery to just take that little step, deal with things when they need to be dealt with, and then deal with them in a way that is going to be received rather than, brushed off or resented or whatever, is also really key. So, I mean, I think any person who's reasonably self-aware has had to deal with conflict in varying ways through their life. So it's figuring out those patterns that might be holding them back. I mean, a lot of these things come from childhood, which is, I mean, we're not going psychotherapy by any stretch, but you do have to understand, again, triggers. What makes you either fight or flight? What makes you feel like you need to change things? And also, again, for me, I think a lot of it is somatic. Like the more I read and learn about the body responses, it's also understanding when you have a feeling, whatever your stress response is, how to breathe through it and how to not take it personally, right? Like, and if they have feedback for you that feels, maybe attacking or not appropriate, breathing through it and just still trying to come back to the real point. So it takes practice. It's not easy and it takes practice for sure. But when you keep those higher values in mind, and that's the other thing too, keeping in the values that you've set up for yourself around whatever that your highest values might be, also helps you keep the bigger picture in sight, right? You don't get bogged down into this whatever this one conflict might be, because you're gonna, particularly as a leader, I mean, you're gonna have conflict in your life no matter what, but particularly as a leader, approaching it as a person who is emotionally aware and compassionate is always going to get you so much further than trying to avoid it, frankly, or trying to avoid getting better at it.
That's such great advice, I think, for really anyone who's trying to take on a leadership position, but especially our listeners who are early stage founders and people who are thinking about building a company or going through that process. And early on, you're wearing so many different hats and you come across
Mm-hmm.
conflict all the time, right? It could
Yeah.
be,
Oh, yeah.
we need this product feature. I don't agree with our marketing strategy. Why our financial projections look like this, right? You come across in all these ways. And so, you especially have to deal with it head on. So that's terrific advice. And we've talked a lot about what it means to develop leadership individually or internally. How can people go about establishing cultures of leadership, especially in new organizations like startups where they kind of have a clean slate to work with from day
Mm-hmm.
one? How do you help people, or how do you advise that people go about establishing a broader culture of leadership to facilitate some of these things we've talked about in their team more broadly?
Yeah, that's such a good, it's such a good question. And such a good point. Because yeah, I think that understanding what an advantage that you're at when you're at that stage, if you can literally create it however you want to be, if you're a little more intentional about it, there are some ways to really make that baked in, basically. And I think that clearly it starts with the leader, the founder, or whoever is in charge of making those decisions at that point, right? So it's walking your talk in that way, of course, but it's also I mean, depending on how you have your structure, this could look a lot of different ways, but it's that accountability, right? Baking in that accountability in ways that really keep people engaged. The more you can motivate people to not let other people down, not in like a workaholic, guilty, freaky kind of way, right? But more in like I care about these people and I said I would do this thing and I'm getting it done, right? Like clearly they're not going to, you want them to be able to ask for help, etc. But that is leadership, right? Understanding how to lead themselves, understanding and so that, again, that starts with clear expectations. That starts with easy, like boundaries that are very easy to understand. I would say also mission and vision, that needs to be in there as well. I mean, in terms of, it depends on how you would want to word it or what it would be like for your company, but it would be something like, radical accountability, things that would really empower the employee to feel that sense of leadership. And then, of course, be able to give feedback that is taken seriously in a healthy, productive way and feel like they really were heard. I mean, sometimes you're not going to be able to take everybody's suggestions and be like, yes, we're doing that.
Right.
But there is a process around, if there's a process around making sure that that's systematic, like we are hearing what people are saying in some way, and then letting them know, like, hey, you know what, this isn't something that we can do right now, and here's why, still empowers people to lead from that level, but without feeling like it's just lip service. Even if you can't use what they're saying, but they might see you using somebody else's thing, and so you're actually, again, walking your talk, seeing that stuff come into action. So, I mean, that's a whole other podcast, but there are definitely ways to set that culture into place early on, by being intentional about a few of these choices. And they're not big, they're not hard. They're just, you have to be intentional.
I think it's a great point because it's so easy to lose sight of some of these things, right? When you're trying to launch your MVP or go out and fundraise or whatever it may be, that you're right. They do take effort, but it's not like they're particularly complicated, but you certainly need to give them focus and give them attention.
Yes.
Intention, I think is a great word for it. Before we hop into our 3-question finale, one last question. Is there someone you look to as an example of particularly strong leadership? And it could be someone, you've worked with in a company or someone you just see out there in the public today. Is there one or two people, and why them, specifically?
Yeah. I would say I would probably go famous for this one, but there's a couple. I'm a big fan of Ray Dalio. I don't know if you've read Principles, but it's just fantastic. Yeah. So, I mean, I follow his stuff, and I really enjoy the way that he thinks about things and the way that he talks about things. So he's been a big influence for me. Ariana Huffington, I really love because, talk about the art of the pivot, right? I watched her in the 90s. My dad and I used to watch Politically Incorrect, and I remember liking her then, and this woman has done some amazing things with, and then of course changing to Thrive after she had the HuffPost. It's just like, yeah, I get it. I wasn't sleeping enough. I was stressed out. So I started a multi-billion-dollar media empire around it. It's amazing. And then another one for me would be Dolly Parton. I actually write some LinkedIn posts that are based on Dolly quotes. I have been a fan for many, many years, but she's also got, I think, this blend of the sense of humor, the heart, and then backing it up. I mean, she does some amazing charitable work, helping develop the COVID vaccine. I mean, there's just so many things that she is totally herself, maybe probably a caricature of herself too at times, clearly, but just a very powerful leader, and has big blonde hair, right? So I will always be a Dolly fan. I will always love her.
Well, what I love about your answer to that question, Cass, is honestly that you gave 3 very different people, right?
Oh.
From very different backgrounds, from finance to country music and everywhere in between. And that's, for me, that just embodies the fact that, really anyone can be a leader. There is no set background. You don't have to have the MBA, right? And I think that's just a great reminder for our listeners that you don't have to kind of have this predetermined path to be a great leader, be a great founder, be a great, person in whatever you're working towards. So I think that's a great segue into our 3-question grand finale here. If there's one book or blog or resource that you'd recommend founders check out to develop their understanding of leadership, what would it be?
I mean, I would say consistently across the board, the Harvard Business Review. I know it's not a very sexy answer, but I'm just always so blown away with their articles. When I do research for programs or for any emails I'm writing or things like this, I mean, I came across a HBR article from 1992 that was still really relevant. I mean, they just, consistently create amazing content. So I read them a lot. I highly recommend that blog for sure.
It certainly offers some tremendous thought leadership, and I think that's a great recommendation. I'll be honest, I've got my subscription, but I haven't been clicking on those emails, so I need to go back and dig into them. So I appreciate the recommendation. All right,
Yes.
question number 2. What's one project or company that you are really excited about right now? And it doesn't necessarily have to be, related to leadership.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, well, B Corp in general, I think is amazing. But also, so there's this thing called zebra companies, and have you heard of these?
I haven't, not myself actually.
So it's not. I mean, it's not really a company. It's more like a movement, but it's essentially not necessarily B Corp certification, but it's companies that are using a slightly different model to become focus on profitability, but also on people and the planet. I mean, those are the 3 P's, but it's really making that a part of actually what they're doing. I have no problem with like capitalism. I just think that we are evolving, and business needs to keep up with it, right? So I see what they're doing as a really interesting model and a really interesting forerunner for what could be happening. So I love following them, and they call it, like, a group of zebras is called a dazzle. So they have like a conference called DazzleCon.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, so I'm enjoying what they're doing, and I'm really excited to see where that goes.
No, that's terrific. I need to go research myself. I'm not as familiar as I should be with it. So that's
well, I hadn't heard of it until like, I don't know, 6 months ago either. But I mean, it's based off the unicorn idea, right? But these guys are zebras. So yeah, it's a neat movement, and I'm excited to see what happens with them.
Absolutely. All right, Cassa, last question. If our listeners wanted to get in touch with you directly to discuss leadership or your coaching services, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, I mean, well, there's a couple ways. So I'm really active on LinkedIn. That's how we connected. I love LinkedIn. So I'm always open to that. And also my website is cassagrant.com. It's CASSA grant, GRANT.com. And so I have several resources on there for leaders to download if they want. There's one on boosting your message. There's one on storytelling, and there's also one on how to own your weird, I'm calling it. But, just reach out through my website if that works as well. Also, an aside, my name's Rhoda. I'm named after a road in Wyoming. That's why it's 2 S's instead of house in Spanish. So maybe that will help people remember. But yeah, that would probably be the best way, is either through my website or LinkedIn.
Perfect. Well, Cassa, thank you so much. This has been a terrific conversation. I feel like I've learned so much just sitting here over the last 40 minutes or so. So thank you for sharing your insights, and really excited for our listeners to be able to dig into this episode and reach out to you as well for more information and hopefully work with you, because I think in our own way, we're each an offbeat leader, right? Maybe all of us don't necessarily have that full comfort with, leadership on a day-to-day basis with whatever that may be, whether it's communication, dealing with conflict, the various aspects of it. So I'm so glad we had an opportunity to sit down and dig through a lot of these pieces today, and really excited to have you back on the show whenever you're free in the future with your busy schedule.
Yeah, let me know. And I mean, I'm excited to hear the rest of the show and see what you guys are up to too, because I love your mission. And yeah, I'll be following you, not in a creepy way. But thanks again for having me. This has been really
Absolutely
fun, and I really enjoyed it.
So for our listeners at home, I highly recommend you check out Cassa's website at CassaGrant.com, and stay tuned for more information through our social media to connect with Cassa and her leadership resources in the future. Thanks again, Cassa.
Thanks, John.
By now, you're probably familiar with the hot new social media app Clubhouse, where you can join interactive conference calls with celebrities, athletes, business leaders, and a whole lot of other really interesting people. I'm a huge fan of the platform. The only problem is that it's invite only. But the good news is that we're running a contest to give away 3 Clubhouse invitations so that you can get started connecting with your favorite people online. All you have to do to enter the contest is subscribe to the Founders Trust podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or one of our other channels, wherever you prefer to listen, and take a screenshot confirming that you subscribed. Then send that screenshot to us at founderstrustpodcast@markettrust.io, or feel free to DM me on LinkedIn. We'll pick 3 random winners from the entries and announce them during next Tuesday's episode. So subscribe to our channel and enter for a chance to get on Clubhouse in no time at all. So tell me what you think of today's episode. Comment on our social media, or send us an email at founderstrustpodcast@markettrust.io. Now go get building.